Please welcome Sandra Mathison. You can address the mic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ren, and it's lovely to be here. I appreciate the invitation to speak to you today. Just a little personal story to start with. My son actually graduated from secondary school in Vancouver this past June, and one of the lasting memories, at least in the final years of his schooling, which frankly I have to tell you was not necessarily a smooth but oftentimes a rocky career, was the strong bond that he developed with his school counselor. There are just so many ways in which that relationship created a positive sense of his experience at schools and really I think have hopefully will enhance the quality of his life as he goes on. Interestingly enough, on the day of graduation, where there's a flurry of picture taking and excitement, one of the things that my son wanted most was to have his picture taken with his school counselor. I think a testament to how genuinely meaningful that experience was to him. What's interesting is that my son is away at college in the U.S. right now, and you think about the relationships that you as a parent and your children have with the school and school counselors as being something that is situated just within the school. But just about a week ago, I had an email from his school counselor who, and I don't know if she's here, but if she's here, she knows who she is, had an email from her asking how my son was doing. So the reach that you have clearly sometimes extends well beyond the simple boundaries of the school building. So thanks to that school counselor who made a real difference in my son's experience and also in the experience that we as a family had. Many people, including oftentimes ourselves, have what I think are romanticized images of what schools are like. Sometimes we envision a school that's from the past. Sometimes a little more recent past, maybe a school that we ourselves went to. Sometimes we think about the schools that we work in. Sometimes we think about schools as places where there is rich technology. Sometimes we think about schools as places where practical skills are learned. But if you think about these images that I've shown you, and most of the images that we hold in our mind of schools, we think first and foremost of classrooms, a place where much, but certainly not all, of schooling occurs. Most people do not have a mental image of schools and schooling as the complex place that they have become. Places where there's far greater diversity among children in abilities, differential access to the dominant language, differential access to the kind of social capital that is important in schooling, the diversity in family structures, and many other forms of diversity. These are places where there is also much greater differentiation in jobs. So there are many kinds of professionals who work in schools, not just teachers. School counselors, of course, but also a range of support workers, resource teachers, teacher librarians, technicians, volunteer coaches, police officers, and many others as well. Schools are also places that we think of as being face-to-face relationships, but they are also, in this contemporary time, created and sustained through technology and social media. So schools are a microcosm of society. It's kind of a truism, but they reflect society's complex psychological, social, and economic conditions. It's critical to appreciate the pervasive effects of these contextual factors. And well, maybe they're perverse too. Things like race, class, poverty, fluency, and even simply access to English as the dominant language in schools, and the differential funding of education that occurs across districts, even schools within districts. And these are revealed in issues and concerns that need to be dealt with, issues of homelessness, abuse of many different kinds, racism, and just the simple matter of communicating when not everybody speaks the same language. We're also much more aware of mental health issues. Whether or not their prevalence has actually increased, schools are now places where these issues present themselves and where help is sought. At any given time, estimates are that 15% of children and adolescents suffer from some sort of mental illness, and that increases to 18% when you look at kids who are 15 to young adulthood of 24 years of age. About 1 in 7 children suffer from some form of anxiety. In general, those who have mental health issues have a 20% chance of having substance abuse or addiction issues. Nearly 1/3 of First Nations children in Canada under the age of 15 use solvents. More than 1/3 of BC secondary students say they know someone who has attempted or committed suicide. 1/3. 1/3. Estimates are that 70% of mental illnesses have their onset in childhood or adolescence. This is the context, but there's a significant rhetoric that suggests that good teaching can overcome all that local contexts throw a school's way. For example, thoughtful teaching is primarily what is required to meet the needs of that homeless child who comes to school perhaps hungry, tired, and stressed from having spent the night in a shelter. While better, more contextually sensitive teaching would certainly help, focusing on what happens in classrooms will never be sufficient to make schools places where the needs of all students are met. Most current models of school improvement emphasize outcome measures, and oftentimes a very small number of outcome measures, those that we're all familiar with in British Columbia, like, for example, the Foundation Skills Assessment scores, or the number of students who are passing provincial exams, or the number of students who are graduating from secondary schools. Rather than simply emphasizing the quality of teaching and learning, or we would hope attending to the complex and multifaceted context within which schools operate, or we would hope there would be more emphasis on the complex and multifaceted place that schools have become as experienced by the people who work within their walls. So thinking about our schools in a way that's more informed by community organizing rather than by a more technically driven market-based strategy are necessary. These models suggest that variety of professionals, in addition to teachers, are necessary to create positive conditions for learning. There is a small, but I would say growing body of literature that looks at how non-instructional professionals, like school counselors, but also school psychologists, nurses, social workers, and so on, contribute positively and significantly to the kind of improvements in schools and education that we see as desirable. For school counselors especially, the research shows us that there is a very significant and positive effect on the management of discipline issues. That there's a small, but again, very positive effect on student achievement, especially at the elementary school level. And that school counselors have been fairly successful and efficacious in decreasing attrition in secondary schools. So while there's an understandable emphasis on the key role that teachers play in school improvement and on enhancing student learning, it's critically important to think bigger. If we desire democratic schools that really will be successful at meeting the needs of all children. So there are two broad strategies, I think, that help us to think about how to create democratic schools. The first is the notion of engaging a broad cross-section of communities. Every school is made up of a series of sub-communities, sometimes identified with roles like teachers, administrators, school counselors, and so on. And it requires the participation and effort of all of those communities to plan and implement strategies that are tailored to the particular needs of a school or a school district. So it's about recognizing the special interests and expertise that each stakeholder group brings to the task of developing and sustaining democratic schools. And the second is that we need to think about schools not in isolation, but to surround them with comprehensive wraparound supports. Schools exist within their communities, and we need to be mindful of thinking about how to capitalize on the fact that there is a much larger community within which the community of the school exists. So we need to recognize that schools cannot and probably should not have to do it all. I think that school counselors are specially positioned to support these strategies. They already naturally have a pivotal role to play in the social, emotional, character, academic, and vocational development of students, all the way from early childhood on through high school. And they're especially well positioned to promote the engagement of various stakeholders, those both within the school but also through their connections outside into the connected community. But it's important to do a bit of a reality check. School counselors, it seems to me, are often asked to do an impossibly broad range of tasks as first responders. They certainly advise students on educational choices, both those that they make within the school context and beyond to post-secondary education. They're expected to educate all students about health and safety, to provide advice and support on a whole wide range of personal matters, and also to provide intensive one-on-one counseling for those who have the most acute needs. Counselors do this in situations where there's an ever-increasing number of crises to which they're asked to react. Personal and social crises involving violence, war, catastrophe, divorce, death, suicide. Add to this the increased number of students each school counselor is responsible for. The ratios have increased from, in 2002, at least the law said that it was 1 counselor to 320 students. There are many schools now where that may actually exceed 1,000 students per counselor. That's an awful lot to ask of a relatively small group of professionals working in schools. For school counselors to be effective and to convince others of their effectiveness, it may be helpful to think about the notion of triage when you think about your work. So you know what that idea is. An emergency room physician, for example, makes judgments about the relative severity of incoming patients' conditions in order to meet the needs of all the patients. This means that patients may receive immediate care regardless of when they arrived, while others perhaps wait longer. School counselors might use this concept of triage to think about their work in most effectively meeting the needs of all students, but it probably won't look the same. Rather than attending first and spending most time with the acute cases, school counselors probably need to spend most of their time in ways that help most people in the school and less of their time serving the specific, albeit acute needs of a few people. This triage scenario may be a little problematic, especially if you see your primary role as providing individual personal support to students. If school counselors see themselves primarily as first responders, your jobs will be difficult, frustrating, and possibly ineffectual. Not because you're ineffectual, but because no one can be all of these things to all children. School counselors need to provide the on-the-ground supports to students, there's no doubt. But the value of school counselors can add to democratic schools is equally in the roles they assume with other adults and in creating and fostering positive solutions in that school context. So because of all of the sociocultural and economic factors I've mentioned previously, like the increased complexity of schooling, the manifestation of social conditions like poverty and language and cultural differences, the changing social relations that result in systemic behaviors like bullying, much greater awareness of mental health issues, the need for more and differentiated academic supports that benefit all students, and the unreasonable increase in your workload, school counselors need to help other members of their school communities understand that their role is bigger and that their contributions are as problem solvers, identifiers, and consultants, a role that connects people to solutions and to resources. Let me say that I expect that in my triage metaphor and in what I've described, there may be some tension for you. That there are at least some school counselors who want first and foremost to help individual students, to solve their problems, to alleviate their pain. And so conceptualizing one's role in a way that focuses more on the social, emotional, and health of most students and the school as an environment compromises that desire. However, there will never come a day when the school counselor role is synonymous with that of a therapist or a psychologist, even if others try and simplistically define your role as such. A recent study by Education Trust in the U.S. characterized the current role of school counselors in two ways, what I've called now and then. The now role focuses on school counselors as mental health professionals who facilitate academic planning both in school and for post-secondary options with students who are interested, and where school counselors are seen as ancillary and support staff that assist with the necessary record keeping and may work at least in part in isolation from others in the school. The then or the future vision that Education Trust gives us is one where the school counselor's role shifts to a focus on the academic success of all students, a vision that sees mental health in service of success within the school context, and where school counselors are educational team members who knowledgeably can broker services on behalf of students, parents, teachers, and the school community as a whole. School counselors in this new vision are leaders, planners, change agents who take a big picture view of the health of schools. I suspect that in reality, many school counselors are in a space between now and then, working to take on more systemic leadership roles while still trying to keep up their work as mental health providers. Moving more fully to then, from now, obviously takes some dialogue, discussion, consideration of where you want to move, some work, and some possible redefinition. But stay with me, and if you share this vision for a moment, you need to advocate for a leadership role, one that emphasizes problem solving and consulting, one that contextualizes your work within schools as a whole, and one that refuses to be defined only as a direct service provider dealing primarily with a small number of acute cases. So what do I mean by advocacy? Advocacy of any kind is the blending of professional specialized knowledge with our own professional ethics in a political context. And we do that in order to create the opportunity for self-initiated, and I mean that both individually and much broader as a group, rational and strategic action to help transform the systems and improve the context within which we work that will shape future behavior, actions, and choices. So it's a generic, but I think helpful way of thinking about what advocacy is. So school counselors advocating for school counseling is about blending knowledge of things like prevention and intervention and caring for others in complex organizations to improve the health of schools, in practice, in policy, and in the lives of children and adults. You already know a lot about advocacy. Each one of you practices these skills and exercises your knowledge about advocacy routinely in your work, especially with regard to students. Advocacy is also important at the professional, policy, and systemic levels. So let me put a little bit of formalism to what you probably already know a lot about and have thought that you act on and may not have thought in a formalistic kind of way about. So here's a framework that helps us to think more systematically about what advocacy is. Always, advocacy begins with a decision to take action. We're moved to advocate when we sense that we or our constituencies are treated unfairly or improperly. This move to action is critical, as it's easy to see advocacy in a negative light. And indeed, there are many instances where the media, those who might not be our friends, will work hard to cast advocacy as a negative action, as a self-serving kind of action. Individuals are sometimes hesitant to be advocates about their profession and the policies and practices that affect them because they may think it's outside of their area of expertise, or they may think that it's such a big problem that they can't possibly make a difference, or that it's not professional to blow your own horn. But advocacy is a professional responsibility. It's one that involves many roles, and one can find a place for oneself as an advocate by thinking about the complexity of the roles. So it involves certainly a representative role, that is, that we sometimes speak for others. It involves an accompanying role where we speak with others, an empowering role where we try to help others speak for themselves, or a mediating role, facilitating communication, a modeling role, demonstrating to others what good professional practice is, a negotiating role, bargaining with power brokers, and a networking role, helping to build coalitions among individuals and groups. Unlike many professionals, school counselors already understand and practice all of these roles, at least in some contexts, and as I've said, especially with regard to the work that you do for individual and groups of students. And so the move to action may just be about expanding the context of advocacy. The second feature of advocacy is the importance of selecting an issue. Indeed, when we think about advocating within a professional context, there are a whole array of possibilities, sometimes an overwhelming number of concerns that we might have. But to be effective, one must select an issue. Not everything can be changed at once. Sometimes seemingly small issues that have a high probability of success in resolving are good places to start. Advocating successfully on one issue leads to greater likelihood to success in the future. A third feature is to understand the political context within which you work. Learn about who makes decisions about what. How are those decisions not only made, but enforced? Advocacy requires a delicate balance between condemnation and cooperation. While on the one hand, we want to highlight the inadequacies of policies or practices, like the tremendous caseloads that you carry, we also want to work collaboratively with those who have the authority to make decisions to change those very policies. Suggesting viable alternatives, for example, is critical to be effective in the collaborative and cooperative part of advocacy. Analyzing who your potential allies and adversaries are facilitates walking that fine line between condemnation and cooperation. The fourth feature of effective advocacy is to do your homework, to know what you're talking about. Understanding and being able to communicate what is known about what works is helpful. But also it's important to connect your issue to other issues that are in the marketplace of ideas, such as current controversies or issues covered in the media. For example, the recent coverage of the very sad and unfortunate death of Amanda Todd provides just this sort of potential connection. The fifth feature of advocacy is to get people involved in talking about your issue rather than talking to people or at people. Engaging genuinely with the various communities that are in and surround the schools may be a long process, but when people participate, they're more likely to be on board with the changes that are desirable. Sixth feature is to think strategically. While advocacy is certainly about getting issues on the table, effective advocacy also has to at least tentatively have an expectation of what the desirable outcomes might be. Working toward a goal increases the likelihood of success. Goals can be short or long term, and as simple as changing a small organizational practice, but they might be as large as seeking a change in a law or a regulation. The seventh feature is to plan for communication. Changes in practices and policies are seldom made on the basis of facts alone, and how information and discussion is packaged matters. Knowing who your primary audiences are and then tailoring messages to their interests is key. Marketing research tells us all kinds of things that we should do, like keep our message simple and concise, avoid jargon, use language that's appropriate for the audience that we're speaking to. It's also strategic to give people an idea of what they can do to help and not stop simply at raising awareness. I remember, as an example, for many, many years as a faculty union officer in higher education, whenever we were advocating for an issue, we always had plenty of paper and addresses to which people could write letters and send immediately right on the spot. So having some very concrete kind of ways in which people can participate with you is helpful. Advocacy isn't always something that can be planned, and so opportunities arise fortuitously, and you need to take advantage of those to champion a cause. Using or creating events that facilitate discussions is important. Again, to use Amanda Todd's suicide as an example, the school administrator, who was quoted in the news reports subsequent to her death, saying that supports were in place for her at the school and community level, whether that's true or not, does nothing to support advocacy for an increase in the awareness of, funding for, or programs that address the very real and systemic issue of bullying, especially cyberbullying, that schools and you as counselors have to deal with all the time. A lost opportunity. So opportunities for advocacy are oftentimes motivated by events that you can't anticipate. Elections, impending possible legislation, or even a quiet news day are all possible opportunities to take advantage of. And the last item in this framework for advocacy is to take the long-term, organic, developmental view. You want to achieve your goals. The process will no doubt be long-term, and there are intermediate benefits to celebrate along the way. So when we begin to think about advocacy for issues we care about, we need to remember that simply articulating what important priorities are and getting people engaged and involved in practicing advocacy are important intermediate outcomes and not to be diminished. As I've already said, school counselors have already special knowledge and skills to draw on to educate others about how schools and communities can be effective for all students around social, emotional, academic, and physical health. You have a strength of your own social, emotional learning skills and leadership competencies. Don't accept being told what to do. Put the use of the skills of social awareness that you have to advocate for what you know are programs, initiatives, and roles that are sensible and workable in the context within which you work. Use those strong interpersonal skills and relationships with all the schooling stakeholders that you interact with to advocate for issues that you care about in the context in which you work. Use what is your natural proclivity to be proactive and resist being drawn into a reactive mode. You know an awful lot about prevention. You know an awful lot about what could happen systemically to help most kids. And you need to remember that and not lose it in the swirl of the moment when others oftentimes are defining your time as dealing with a crisis. And you need to educate others about what school counselors can and ought to do in developing these kind of democratic and community responsive schools. It's likely that most groups, even those you might not initially think of, could use a little re-education. Certainly your school district trustees and administrators, but also even teachers. Teachers have oftentimes a notion of the role of school counselors that they carry with them from their past. Parents, to be sure, and often mental health professionals who operate outside of schools and provide you with supports. You do this, of course, in the context of your work interactions, but I would also suggest you can help to do this re-education by developing a presence in other ways. On your school's website, attend PAC meetings, use social media. It's not going away, folks. It's here to stay. You need to use it to your best advantage. Facebook, Twitter, but also creating podcasts, blogs, wikis are really dynamic ways of interacting with others about the work that you do and the issues that you care about. Uses of social media are now referred to as e-advocacy, and they're seen as strategies where we can reach large audiences cost-effectively. Do all of this in and with the media. Cultivate relationships with columnists and TV and radio and talk show hosts who cover education, mental health, gender, even business writers, because there are many issues that relate to poverty, homelessness, workforce preparation. You need to educate the media about what the important issues are. Know that the media loves a good story with a local human element to it. Radio programs love good, strong voices. Take advantage of those things in order to develop and sustain those relationships. Of course, lobby politicians and other decision makers by talking and writing letters, and partner with others when it makes sense. Again, when I was a union officer in the largest higher education union in the world, there were many times when we partnered with our K-12 colleagues because it made sense to package the issues as a K-16 issue, something that mattered all the way from an early childhood through graduating with a baccalaureate degree. But there are other instances where that partnership would have worked against us. So to think strategically about when it's helpful and when it's not helpful. And I won't tell you who I think the primary partnership that you should think about is, but you probably know. And when you educate people about what you do, don't just whinge. Don't just complain. Certainly talk about the challenges, but also talk about victories. Certainly the difficulties of doing your work, but also the joys that you experience contributing to the academic and mental health of students. And lastly, sustain and nurture yourselves, and you will be better advocates both for your profession and for yourself personally. Develop communities of practice that allow you to learn from one another, to build solidarity among school counselors, to provide the kind of support that you need for the sorts of secondary trauma that no doubt oftentimes come with the very difficult job that you do. And again, technology can be your friend here. I think, and I didn't always think this, and perhaps the little story that I told at the beginning about the positive experience that my son had with a school counselor, I believe that school counselors can and ought to be leaders in creating democratic schools. They have a special position that allows for nurturing and supporting everyone who can work towards this kind of ideal. Napoleon said, "A leader is a dealer in hope." For my money, school counselors are dealers of hope. Thank you very much.